Mayoral Memo with Matthew Dickerson from Dubbo Regional Council.
You're listening to Tony Graham on Binjang 91.5, and on the line in Studio 2 this afternoon I have Matthew Dickerson, who's ready to engage me with an interesting conversation about the committee meetings that have occurred on Friday night. So how are you going there, sitting in the Taj Mahal on Bond Street in Sydney?
You're building it up, Tony, assuming that it's going to be an interesting conversation. I'm always full of facts, but some people say those facts aren't always that interesting. But we'll make sure that we present all the facts to people.
Okay, all right. Well, I wasn't too far from the facts there.
No, you're right.
Okay, well, the first thing we'll talk about is in that meeting there was a councillor, and my understanding is that it was Josh Black who raised, from what my understandings are, a situation where he wants to geo-fence a money spend worth $950,000 from Squadron Energy towards an arts program in the Dubbo community, 15 kilometres within a firming station that's been built by Squadron Energy as part of the RES arrangements, and he wants to make sure that the money is spent within that radius, 15 kilometres. So most people would look at that and say, well, that's very parochial and also Dubbo-centric. So what's your answer to that?
Well, I'll go back a step first because I want to talk about the project, and I think we've done very well to get where we are at this stage with the project. So you're quite correct. This is a firming power station. This is located in some industrial land on Yarrandale Road in Dubbo. And again, when I say located, it will be built. It hasn't been built yet. It's basically a state significant development application. It doesn't go through council. It's a too large a project for council, so it's going through the SSD process. It's, I think, a pretty exciting project because what they'll be doing is they'll be producing hydrogen from excess renewable power that will be as part of our RES. And by producing that hydrogen, so basically you'll have green hydrogen, you'll then have the ability for that hydrogen to be mixed with gas and essentially be able to bring power on when needed for that firming power. And when I talk about firming power, it's basically to keep the even supply of power occurring. So when the sun's not shining or the wind's not blowing, you need some way of producing power. So I think pretty exciting project, $190 million project, capacity of 64 megawatts. So overall, very good. Now, Tony, you and I have talked before about the frustration that we have as a council with planning agreements, voluntary planning agreements, where typically it seems that if it's a wind farm, then we get some money out of wind farms. If it's a solar farm, we struggle. Batteries, we've had some success, but at a lower level. And a firming power station, well, there's no requirement whatsoever for any money to go towards the local community from something like a firming power station. But our staff have had a discussion, and I must admit that Squadron Energy have been very good to deal with all the projects we've been looking at, and this project is proposed by Squadron Energy. So in terms of that discussion, rather than the 1.5%, which is what we aim for with wind farms and solar farms, the proposal from Squadron Energy is 0.5% of the capital investment value, which is still reasonable. Again, we'd love 1.5%, but again, keep in mind, they don't have to give anything. So 0.5% is about 0.5% more than they have to give. That equates to $950,000. So they've had some discussions. Essentially, we've given them our strategy, our vision forward for the community, and we've said the $950,000, we want you to, because there's no direct impacts on the community, you to participate in where you'd like to see your money. If you like, it's just a grant from Squadron Energy to make the community better. In that process, they've chosen our existing public art strategy to basically work on putting more art around the community, which I think is a wonderful thing. And it's their money, and if they want to use it in that way or not give us anything at all, then I'm happy for them to pick one of our existing strategies. So well done to our staff, well done to Squadron Energy. It really came to council, to the committee meetings of council, to basically be endorsed or modified if need be by our councillors and then go through to a council meeting in 2 weeks' time. And as a bit of a surprise to everyone, that yes, it was brought forward as a proposal to spend that money not across the Dubbo LGA, because we are one local government area now, 7,536 square kilometres, Dubbo Regional Council LGA. We're all one. We shouldn't be breaking it up and trying to have favourites within that overall LGA. But certainly it was proposed to keep that money within a 15-kilometre radius of the firming power station, which would basically mean spend the money in Dubbo and nowhere else. Now, that was debated at council. In the end, a majority of councils said yes to that. But again, that's only going to be a recommendation from the committees to the council meeting in 2 weeks' time. So the council meeting on the 23rd of May will be when it will be finally resolved. So I'd encourage community members to talk to councillors and tell them whether they think that's a good idea or not a good idea.
Yeah, and my understanding, of course, is what I mentioned earlier is all on the public record, from council's public record. It's public knowledge, in other words. And you did also explain, so that would be a yes to that?
Yeah, that's right. You can watch the meeting if you'd like. You can see what the debate was, how the debate went. So all of our standing committee meetings and council meetings are streamed live, but also you can watch the recording of those as well.
Yeah, and of course the other thing too we did mention was, in our conversation earlier on, Matthew, was there's a little bit of a difference here. Infrastructure that impacts local areas like solar panels and wind turbines in a particular community, and where there's money given to that community, it's more or less a compensation for that infrastructure being disruptive to some extent in the community. It's a little bit different to this situation with the firming station, isn't it, really?
I think it is, Tony. I think you're spot on there. In the normal process for planning agreements, it is designed to offset the direct impact. So if you've got loss of employment, for example, a solar farm comes along and that farm's not used for normal farming, then you might have a loss of income from the employees that might have been employed there. There might be some loss to income of suppliers, or there might be some visual impacts. So the money for planning agreements for wind and solar are typically spent in a closer area around where those direct impacts are. And there might be some money spent in a wider scenario, but those direct impacts. With something like this, Tony, this is in an industrial area. Things are built in industrial areas all the time. It could be a factory, it could be producing something, it could be a distribution area. This particular firming power station going into an industrial area is no different to most other things going into an industrial area. I firmly believe it's just the fact that Squadron Energy are very focused on making sure that they are basically getting social licence from the community for the projects they're doing. I think they've got a good social focus, and I think they have been very good to deal with in all of our dealings so far. So I think when we discussed this with them, they were okay to come on board. Again, not at 1.5%, but they were okay to come on board at that 0.5%. That $950,000 would effectively be an upfront payment. But keep in mind that they've got to agree to this. So even though our recommendation from the committees was to change what their letter of offer was, if we go through the council meeting and go back to them, they've got every right to say no to that. Now, again, their initial letter of offer that was made to us talked about the $950,000. They talked about it being a lump sum. They talked about it being set towards our public art strategy 2023 to 2033, which doesn't have any restrictions on distance away from any particular project. So they could very well say, well, our letter of offer didn't include a 15-kilometre radius. Now, I have no idea whether they'll say that or not. It hasn't been resolved by council yet, but in 2 weeks' time, when that goes through council, if it is, then we've got to go back and then renegotiate that with Squadron.
Yeah, that's fair enough. And I think it's also important for our listeners to understand, where the politics lay with the different councillors, in the council, which is a regional council, and whether, you have parochial councillors who are just wanting money spent locally for their constituents, or whether they're making decisions based on the benefit to the wider LGA. I think our listeners really need to know that, because there's an election coming up and they have to make a decision about, hopefully, let's do things for the betterment of the whole LGA rather than looking at things, through a microscope.
One of the things that's important, Tony, is you go back to the amalgamation. I was Dubbo City Council Mayor at the time, and I certainly fought hard against it. Anne Jones was the Wellington Shire Council Mayor, and she fought against it as well. The state government made a decision. On the 12th of May 2016, the state government made a decision. I wasn't happy about that. Anne Jones wasn't happy about that. We've now moved on. It's more than 8 years since that particular time. In fact, in a couple of days' time, it'll be 8 years since that announcement was made, since the decision was made. And that's the hand we've been dealt. You've got to play the hand you've been dealt. There is no value for anyone to keep going back and saying, before the amalgamation this, before the amalgamation that. We've got the amalgamation. We've got to deal with the overall local government area as one local government area.
That's the reality that we face.
Yes, indeed.
If we're going to be moving forward, that's what we have to deal with in a way that moves everything forward, obviously. And there's no going back, I would say, unfortunately, but that's my opinion, of course. And a lot of people share that opinion, all over the current LGA, to be honest. But, it is what it is. And it's just a matter of working together and making it as good as it possibly can be, and if not even better than what it was before. And that should be the aim.
The value that we can get out of the two areas combined together into one, we've got to look for those opportunities. But ultimately, Tony, I can't speak for all councillors, but I know for myself when I'm making decisions on council, I'm trying to think of 56,720 people. That's the population of our LGA. And I'm trying to make decisions that are going to be for the best outcome for 56,720, not for one section, not for one individual, not for a small group. It's got to be always that group. Now, there are times you make decisions, Tony, that are better for some parts of the LGA and not as good for the other parts.
Yeah.
That's the reality of decision-making in local government. But what you should be doing is always looking at how is this going to be the best for the majority of people in our LGA.
Yes, absolutely. Now, moving along to tourism and the Wellington Caves, apparently there's some good news there.
Yeah, so one of the things that we get, and I'd encourage people to look through the information that we receive on council, because one of the things that we get each month at our committee meetings is a list of what we call our dashboard, and this is actually brought forward by Councillor Mann very early in our council time, just to get a snapshot each month of how various things are performing. So I actually find it quite interesting to look at that, and a whole range of different facilities and different parts of council given different data on different reports on, but the Wellington Caves is one of those. And I'll just run you through a couple of numbers, and I'm going to just do a couple of month-by-month comparisons. So, for example, compare March. March is the most recent month in this report. Compare March this year to March last year, for example. So there were 1,782 people that paid to go through Wellington Caves this March, 674 last March. Go back to February, 841 this year, 552 last year. January, 3,324 this year, 1,785 last year. Even back to December, 2,085. December last year, 1,171. December the year before. So we're getting some good, strong numbers there. And again, keep going back month by month. We really go right back to September last year compared to September the previous year before we get a month the previous year that was higher. So over those last 6 months, we've done very well at Wellington Caves, and good strong signs of things in the economy overall picking up, but also good signs seeing people visiting the caves there, which I think is a great tourism attraction in Wellington.
Yes, look, the dashboard snapshot is a very, very good idea. We should all congratulate Councillor Mann for that idea coming forward, because it's been very beneficial, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, definitely. And keep in mind, I did mention Councillor Mann, but any decision of council is a majority decision of council. So if any councillor brings forward an idea that's not a great idea, then councillors will vote against it. If it's a great idea, they'll hopefully vote in favour of it. So when Councillor Mann brought forward that idea, it still had to be supported by councillors, which it was. And again, typically I find that good ideas are generally supported by councillors.
Yeah. Now, moving on to the next topic, I'll make this the last topic, I think. Unfortunately, the Dream Festival has had to be put into abeyance. So would you like to elaborate on that?
Yeah, almost. So keep in mind that all of these things that happen at the committee meetings are recommendations through to the actual council meeting. So no decision has been made, but a clear indication of which way councillors are looking at going with that. We, as you remember, invited expressions of interest for someone to deliver the dream. We didn't think it was appropriate for our staff to continue to deliver the dream. When the submissions closed the first time, we had no submissions, but we got some feedback from two organisations to say that they tried to put submissions in, but from a technical aspect, it didn't work. So we reopened those for a short period of time and then allowed those to put those in. So 2 submissions were received. And when I say 2, one was a submission to run it. The other one was really a submission to support the running of it. And the one submission that was in there from Orascon was almost a reluctant submission, I would say. They weren't convinced that they could run it in the same way it was run before. There were a few caveats on it. And in the end, councillors talked about it, discussed it. And then the recommendation to council is that they put the Dream Festivals, that we put the Dream Festival into abeyance. There's $40,000 we had allocated for the event. We discussed putting that into 2 different funds, the Spark Support Grant Fund and the Event Assistance Program, and to still use that money in basically in the community for community events, and then look at it again next year. But in the meantime, if any organisation does want to run it, we've got those assets, we've got the name itself, the logo. There's nothing stopping us giving permission for someone else to run an event called The Dream and use those assets and use the knowledge that people gain around Dream, use that to the advantage of some other festival. So it's not dead and buried. It has to have a final decision at a council meeting, but if the decision goes this same way, then there will be no Dream Festival this year, Tony.
Okay. Matthew, look, thanks very much for your time, and of course we'll be anxiously awaiting in a few weeks' time, or less than a few weeks now, I guess, the outcomes of these committee meeting recommendations to the Ordinary Committee of Council to see where it all lands. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens there.
Yeah, definitely.
And we'll be talking about that afterwards, of course.
Yeah, that's right. And as I say, don't hesitate. Contact your local councillor, tell them your opinion, because all of these things are only recommendations. No final decision has been made, but the votes have been cast on this at a committee meeting, so you get an indication of where councillors are thinking.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much, Matthew.
Thank you, Tony. Always my pleasure.
Okay, and we've been talking to the Mayor of Dubbo Regional Council, Matthew Dickerson, on Binjang 91.5.
Mayoral Memo with Matthew Dickerson from Dubbo Regional Council.